Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, this is going to be a slightly different episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. And I'm your host, Andrew Langer, and so glad you can join us. I wanted to do something special in honor of September 11th, which is the day this podcast is being released. Not the day we're recording it, but the day that it is being released. It's a day that still hangs heavy in my mind. I have a hard time, admittedly have a hard time going to New York, Lower Manhattan still, growing up there. My own story was, before I bring our guest on, is I was just a block and a half away from the White House when the attacks on September 11th happened. I watched D.C. get very chaotic and then get eerily quiet. And, you know, obviously dealt with all kinds of personal things and had friends of family members and people that my family members knew who were killed in those attacks. So it's a very solemn day for me. And I want to bring our guest on. His name is Ken Mehlman. And I've known Ken I first worked with Ken about 30 years ago, which I'm having a hard time wrapping my head around, Ken. When he was an attorney in D.C., he was an attorney at Aiken Gum Strauss Hauer and Feld, and I was working for a partner there. But Ken is an attorney. He's a political strategist. He's also the former chairman of the Republican National Committee. He served in that capacity from 2005 to 2007. Before leading the RNC, Mehlman managed George W. Bush's 2004 reelection campaign and held various positions in the Bush administration, including the White House's Director of Political Affairs. In addition to his political work, Mehlman pursued a career in finance and investment, and he serves as a partner at global investment firm KKR. And with that in mind, let me bring on Ken. Ken, it's been a very long time. It's been far too long. It's good to see you, sir.
It's good to see you. I'm pleased to see I knew Andrew Langer before he was cool.
Listen, I'm still not cool, but you certainly knew me before I got much larger in carriage, which is a good thing. And maybe later on we'll talk a little bit about some of the old days. But let's start here, Ken. You were at the White House on September 11th, or were you traveling with the president at that point in time?
I was at the White House. As you note, I was the political director. I had that morning had invited several friends over from Capitol Hill for breakfast.
Wow.
So when you're in the White House, those of you that have had the opportunity to serve know that the White House mess, which is run by the Navy, is right next to the Situation Room, where critical national security issues can be securely considered. And the morning of 9/11, 2001, I was hosting several friends for breakfast. And the friends were Paul Ryan. Paul and I started our careers together in politics in 1994. I worked and he worked as budget associates for the House Budget Committee that John Kasich led.
Wow.
And for members of Congress who served on the committee. In my case, it was Lamar Smith of Texas. In his case, he worked for Sam Brownback from Kansas.
Wow.
And so Paul and I became buddies. We also used to work out together up at the gym near Capitol Hill. And other friends who joined us was Rob Portman. Rob Portman I knew as well. Rob Portman would go on to serve in the Bush administration, but at the time was working as a member of the House representing Cincinnati. Bob Ehrlich. Bob was actually the congressman from the district where I grew up, Baltimore County, Maryland.
Sure.
And Rick Lazio. And all those gentlemen were friends, and I had hosted them for breakfast. And we had a nice breakfast. And at the end of the breakfast, we walked out of the White House mess, just turning the corner by the Situation Room. And actually, Kavanaugh today, Brett Kavanaugh's wife, at the time she was Ashley Estes. She is a good friend. She and I worked on the first Bush campaign. And I remember she came around and she said, "Did you hear that a plane hit the World Trade Center?"
Wow.
And she kind of laughed. And I said, "You shouldn't laugh. It's not funny." And she said, I wasn't kidding. And her laughter was more of a nervous laugh.
Oh, sure.
And a few moments later, we saw one of my colleagues from the White House running into the Situation Room in tears.
Wow.
And we realized we were dealing with something really consequential. So I went back to the office where most of my colleagues sat in the Eisenhower Executive Office building. And within minutes, we noticed that there was smoke rising on the horizon from where it was the Pentagon.
Sure.
And you then relatively quickly after that, there wasn't like an alarm system. People just were running office to office saying, get out of the White House, get out of the White House. A plane is coming. And we left the White House. And if you remember, there's that famous picture of the gates opening and everyone running out. And everyone was standing across the street in Lafayette Park.
Oh, yeah.
And I said to about 10 people,
sure,
we shouldn't all stand as a group. If you were trying to decapitate the American government and the people that serve the president are all standing together, that's a bad idea.
Right. Sure.
So a group of us started walking toward Georgetown, and we walked down Pennsylvania Avenue, and I'd say about 15, 20 blocks, we turned back up and walked, ultimately returning to not the White House, but the Chrysler offices where Tim McBride worked, whose wife was Anita McBride, who worked in the White House for First Lady Laura Bush.
Yeah.
And we used their offices. And that day, Brad Blakeman, who was the president's scheduler, Barry Jackson, who was our Office of Strategic Initiatives leader, and myself, political director, we did some research online, and we essentially researched how previous presidents had handled tragedies like this, not from a military perspective, that wasn't our expertise.
From a run of government perspective,
from a leadership perspective.
Sure.
So how many days after Oklahoma City did President Clinton give a national speech?
Right.
And where did he give it? And so when the president returned, we had developed a memo for him that suggested, for example, a speech at the National Cathedral and some of the other leadership that he showed. And that's how we spent much of the day. My home at the time was on Capitol Hill. I lived on Massachusetts Avenue. And I walked home that night to an empty Washington.
Yeah.
And there were on many street corners people who were military, they weren't in tanks or anything, but they were armed in important ways, which is good. Yes. And I remember repeatedly being asked, what are you doing? Where are you going? And I'd be like,
sure,
here's my White House badge. Here's my address. Here's my license. I'm trying to go home. It was a remarkable day. And it was a day that reminds all of us that what really matters most is our own security and the security of others. And it was a day where people in New York showed incredible heroism that just should reinforce in all of our minds the fundamental decency, compassion, and patriotism of our fellow American citizens.
You know, it's interesting. I had no idea that Bob Ehrlich was with you at breakfast that one. I've known Bob forever, for all the years that I lived in Maryland, was working in Maryland. So I've got to tug at him at some point in time about that to share his stories about that. And it's funny, Ken, I remember being over at the White House in that first year and walking through the West Wing with a friend of mine and seeing you running a meeting. And it was a very incongruous moment because I'd known you 10 years prior working, for Roger Marzullo at Akin Gump. And it was a very strange, surreal moment. So let's talk about the aftermath, right? The couple of days after. I've spent some time talking about this. There was a real moment, at a time when, and if you don't want to talk about this, we don't have to, and you can tell me no. But there was a moment where America was able to really come together in a way that we hadn't, and we'd been through some months of some political strife, nothing like what we're facing now, but I think the seeds were sown then. But there was a moment where we could come together, and then that moment sort of slipped away, and there was recrimination, and there were questions about how much pro-Americanism there ought to be. Talk about the moment where we came together. Talk about the work that you all were doing to try to bring America together, in the face of those attacks.
Well, I think we came together in really important ways we should remember. First, the fact that America wasn't attacked on the homeland for the remainder of President Bush's term is not an accident,
Sure.
and it's not the result of luck. It's the result of a combination of incredible leadership by the president and others, and incredible patriotism and courage by women and men serving in our military and our FBI, in law enforcement, all around the world. So the first most important thing that we did for the following 7 years was to protect our homeland.
Yeah.
And that was a Herculean effort that required us to really be smart and creative and innovative. Number one. Number two, we developed a series in a bipartisan way of reforms to make sure that how we fly on planes, how we protect federal buildings, how we improve collaboration between law enforcement and local and state and federal, all improves.
Yeah.
So there was a series of very consequential reforms that Department of Homeland Security, TSA, et cetera, were created. Think about this. I live in New York City. There are more law enforcement professionals focused on anti-terrorism in New York City today as a result of what we learned than the entire Chicago police force.
Wow.
And that's the result of really important work by Republicans, Democrats, and others coming together. So the second big thing we did was develop a series of reforms we may not all appreciate today, but we don't appreciate because those reforms averted further disasters. Number
Right.
two. Third thing that we did, very important, we avoided the mistakes that previous American history had made. So after World War II, there was a government-led systematic effort to intern Japanese, to our terrible discredit. In World War I, German Americans were treated in a terrible way. There's a fantastic new book called American Midnight. I highly recommend your viewers read about that period. During the Cold War, we know we had McCarthyism.
Right.
And President Bush, to his credit, went to a mosque several days after 9/11 to remind Americans that the enemy were a group of people whose ideology perverted a religion, not people that practiced that religion. And that was incredibly important and incredibly necessary, and ultimately made us safer, because some of our best information about where emerging threats were growing, and some of our best allies later on, for example, in the surge, were people who were Muslims, and who recognized the evil of the ideology behind Al-Qaeda and the ideology behind radical Islam. And that wouldn't have been possible if President Bush hadn't appreciated the importance of uniting all Americans who believe in freedom, regardless of how they pray.
You know, it's interesting, Ken, because it reminds me of President Lincoln's approach towards how to mediate with the South, both during and after the Civil War, right? He makes it really clear that it's not the states. I mean, it is the states who are in rebellion, but it's not the people in those states, and it's not all the people in those states, but a certain group of people within those states. So he's really sort of singling out to make it very clear that he was not engaged in a war against the people. So in other words, this is very much of a Lincoln-like moment. George W. Bush doesn't get nearly enough credit for that. I mean, not that I'm going to ask you why not, but I mean, I suppose there's some question as to why, in that particular framing of it, that sort of essentially with malice toward none, with charity toward all, why that doesn't get better player recognition. Why doesn't George Bush get the credit for that?
I don't know the answer to that question. Yeah. I think most fair-minded historians would appreciate that aspect of his legacy. Now, we also made some mistakes.
Right.
So certainly there was a period when how we were interviewing people, enhanced interrogation, etc., I think used tactics that were not appropriate, and we adjusted those. But that was real mistakes that we should acknowledge. Certainly when you then look at what occurred later on in terms of, for example, how the war in Iraq was resourced and fought until the surge, we clearly had insufficient means toward the end we needed to achieve. So I think that there are tremendous lessons from those several years period, many of which are things we can be proud of, but all of them are things we can learn from, including things we need to do better in the future.
Let me ask you this, sort of looking at the work you were doing as political director at the White House, how did that work change in the post 9/11 world? I mean, we're talking about this, but in terms of how you were approaching issues, how you were approaching allies, and frankly, how you were approaching opponents up on Capitol Hill, how did 9/11 sort of change the way you viewed your job as White House political director and how that job was executed?
Well, the job of everyone who serves at the White House is to serve at the direction of the president.
Right.
And that direction isn't just substantive, it's also stylistic and involves leadership. And President Bush made very clear in the aftermath of 9/11 that it wasn't a time for politics.
Yeah.
So certainly for the rest of 2001 and early 2002, our job was to help use the various organisms around the country of politics, whether they be state parties, outside groups, organized interests, etc., and engage with them in a way that would hopefully persuade them to be involved and assisting us in moving legislation like the Department of Homeland Security and other proposals to ensure that the economy wasn't stalled and that the homeland was protected after 9/11.
Yeah. I'm thinking about this because clearly, and honestly, and I'm going to admit this, and I know you're not supposed to admit things you don't know, when you're in Washington. I don't remember what happened in the midterms in 2002 specifically, but you went on to manage.
They were good.
President.
From our perspective, President Bush was the first president
That's right.
whose first midterm he had pickups in since FDR.
There you go. That makes sense. And then you went on to manage the president's campaign in 2004, and he increased his vote totals there, which was something that a lot of folks did. And I made a bet with a high school friend about that election, and actually because I won, he didn't speak to me for a number of years about that, Ken. But so you go on, you go and you run the campaign, and I got to ask you. So how was the transition from political director to, because I want folks to understand, political director to RNC chairman. I'm sorry, political director to campaign manager to RNC chairman. How did that transition go?
So I enjoyed the campaign management position the most.
Yeah.
And the reason I did it was because I like leading organizations. I like managing teams. And I felt like I had a very interesting opportunity to do both. And my job, as I saw it, was I was the CEO of a startup that would get big very quickly, that will be on the front page of the New York Times every single day, and other papers around the country. And you had to hire really good people. You had to motivate people. You had to build a culture of unity and collaboration and commitment to serve the president. And we innovated with some very creative ways to reach voters, whether that be the effort we learned was called micro-targeting at the time. Today,
Sure.
We would call it how we can leverage consumer data to identify predictive analytics as to what political leanings individual voters have, where they get their information, what they would find compelling, et cetera. That was very effective. We developed some incredibly innovative efforts with respect to early voting. Early voting is an advantage for the right, for Republicans, for conservatives. Anyone who tells you it's not doesn't know what they're talking about. You know how I know? Because I did it. And the reality is we studied in 2001 and 2 who tends not to vote. And they tend to often be people, it makes sense, who live in rural areas or ex-urban areas and have a long way to go between home and the voting booth.
Sure.
And so if you can get them to vote early, you can make their life easier. And we flipped 2 states because we understood early voting in a smart way. So there were a whole series of things where we essentially took politics and reduced it to science and data and information, and that helped us win. And finally, critically important, we understood that the party of Lincoln ought to be improving its performance in Black and Hispanic communities. And so we had a very robust effort in both, and we were proud of the outcome.
Yeah, and it certainly, as I said, paid off in 2004, and you go on, you run the RNC. Let's pull it back a little bit more, because I want to circle back to 9/11, because as I said in my introduction, I can't go back. I can't go back. I think last year was the first time since 2001 that I was able to go to Lower Manhattan without it being an overwhelmingly emotional experience for me.
I understand that. And in fact, I live in Manhattan. I live in Chelsea. And usually on 9/11, I will ride my bike down to Freedom Tower and the former home of the World Trade Center. And it's a very emotional and important experience for me.
Yeah, it is still tough. So did you travel? Did you happen to travel with the president up to Yankee Stadium when he threw out the pitch?
I did
you
not
back
that
in
day,
DC?
but I sure was proud to watch that.
Yeah. So I guess, Ken, before I let you go here, before we sort of leave this off, I mean, things have changed.
Yeah.
And the landscape of politics has changed. Not that you need to get into too much depth unless you really want to, but how can we come together? Theoretically, COVID should have been able to, unite Americans, but that quickly became political. I mean, how do we sort of push back against this division and divisiveness that seems to plague our political landscape? I've talked to Leon Panetta about this. I talked to Bob Levy at the Washington Post. He came on and we chatted about things of this nature. Where are your thoughts on all of this? What's one of the ways that we can work to bring people back together?
My thoughts are the importance of e pluribus unum, which is our national creed. Out of many, one. And the way that you come together is you recognize that people who you may disagree with on certain things, you might agree with on other things.
Yeah.
And so you look for ways to bring people together. So what does that mean? First, you listen. You listen what people are saying and try to understand the world from their perspective. We have way too many people whose goal in life is to say, see, I told you so, as opposed to, hey, that's a good point. I can learn something from you. So the first thing we've got to do is not top down, but bottom up. Each of us as Americans live e pluribus unum. Find people that you disagree with and learn about them and figure out ways that you can come up with solutions that address some of the concerns that they might have. That's something that we can do. Second, we can remember, and 9/11 was a good reminder, that Americans who disagree with you or me about our views on domestic or even foreign policy issues are not our enemies.
Yeah.
Enemies are people that fly planes into towers to knock them down.
Right.
Enemies are people that blow up individual civilians. And so we need to not use the false language of war when talking about people that simply disagree on domestic questions, even if they're critically important questions. I know a lot of people that are vets. Almost no vet I know ever refers to political debate in war terms.
Right.
Only people that haven't served and therefore have a lower sense of the real stakes have that attitude. So that's the second thing that I think we can do. And the third thing I think that helps bring us together is we should appreciate the lessons we've learned in American history of what we're able to do when we come together. So COVID is a good example. What we did with Operation Warp Speed was miraculous. It was a second moon landing. It usually takes 4 years at least to get a vaccine. We got a vaccine in 1 year.
Right.
And President Trump and a lot of other people deserve credit. And we should celebrate that. That's incredibly important. And there are other examples too. While I think too much money was spent, the reality is the program that helped keep a lot of small businesses alive was a smart program.
Yeah.
And a good program. And what you'll often find is, here's a lesson. If you're a Republican, sit down and write 5 good things you think President Biden has done. And if you're a Democrat, write 5 things President Trump did. And if you can't do it, you're not living e pluribus unum.
Sure.
One of the best professors I ever had in college was an international affairs professor named Stan Mikulak. And one of the best exercises he did was he made you write a paper that argued one position, and the next day another paper that argued the second position.
Nice.
And it made you much more conversant in not just what the other side thought, but how you made your own case.
Right.
So I think that all those things can help bring people together.
You know, it's interesting. There's a really great piece a professor at George Mason just wrote. He encourages people to drive 50 miles in any direction from where they live. Now, obviously, if you're on the coast, you can't do that, but drive 50 miles in any direction from where you live and have a conversation with somebody there. And I love that. And it's funny because on the issue of spending money during COVID, you know, I'm going to say this. So the partner that Ken and I worked for at Aiken Gump was a gentleman named Roger Marzullo, who was very passionate about private property rights. He and his wife still are passionate about private property rights. And I saw what the government was doing as a taking, right? Essentially, you're shutting down a business. You're taking that business, you know, temporarily for the purposes of dealing with this public health emergency. And yes, I know that there are exceptions for health issues in terms of this, but nevertheless, I saw it as a taking, and therefore the government owed compensation. That's sort of how I viewed it. If you're going to shut these businesses down, then you got to do something about it. Ken, listen, I can't tell you how much I appreciate you coming on, good sir.
It's wonderful to see you, and I know you have a lot of friends who watch this together, and I would just say Godspeed, and all of us on 9/11 ought to take a moment and say a prayer thanking God that we're Americans.
Amen to that.
Because that day we saw how our country comes together, and that day we saw what matters most.
You know something, and that's how I'm going to leave it, Ken. I'm going to say to everybody here, you know, take Ken Mehlman's words to heart. Have a conversation with somebody who may disagree with you on things, especially on 9/11. You know, you go, you let a family member know you love them, a friend you know you love them, give them a hug, but also try to have a conversation with someone whom you may disagree with, and try to come to some kind of an understanding about things, sort of in that.
You know, one other thing you should do
Please.
In the period before 9/11, every person you see who serves as a fire or police, anyone you see in the military, thank them for their service.
With 100%, that's absolutely true. Yes, we, as the husband of a vet, believe me, I agree with that, Ken. Well, listen, Ken Mehlman, thank you so very much for joining us.
Thanks
today.
a lot.
This has been another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I'm your host, Andrew Langer. Enjoy the rest of your lunch.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.